While you're gathering, we're going to begin here. But gather back in here. I want to show you a couple resources. Right now we have just, if you want to get the recorded videos of these sessions, they're going to be available on the Build International YouTube site. We haven't done much work on this in the past. We haven't gave much attention to this, but in the last week, we are now beginning and going forward, we're going to begin to put attention into these matters. So into this form of creating resources for you. So there is a Build International YouTube one, and there's also one called Patterned After Acts. We will probably combine these two in some form. Everything will be available on the Patterned After Acts site. But in the Patterned After Acts one, there's going to be the songs will be available there with all the lyrics, and some of the interviews that we're doing at this conference. Jeff and I will be doing an interview together next week. All this will begin to be available on our YouTube site called Patterned After Acts, and there'll be more content to it every week and every month, probably every month as things goes on. So we have a series. We're going to do really in-depth series, maybe do more with Walter Kaiser, but we'll also do very beginning and elementary type things like, what is the way of Christ and his apostles? What is it? That way you have content that you can send to and use with some of your people and equip them in your churches as well. Okay, we can turn this off now. Let's transition to this session. So in this session, where'd my papers go? Stole my papers, Jeff. Okay.
Because you went on my half.
Yeah. Jeff thinks there's halves to this table. Does anyone see that Jeff is using half of his table? It appears to me that you're using 75% of this table. Anybody want to, let's take a vote on what percentage of the table Jeff is using. Okay, let's not do that. Your microphone's not on, so your jokes are going to be even worse than normal.
You're responsible for those.
So what we want to bring you through now is we, as you know, in order to get a paradigm, a set of patterns back into the world, there is a piece of doing that is you have to rebuild the foundations of things. And part of rebuilding the foundations is you have to have a set of tools that the world can use in order to get them on that new foundation, on that new set of patterns, on that new way of looking and seeing the pattern. So we've been, as you know, over these last 50 years, creating resources, first principles, leadership series, life development series. And now, since 2014, we started on a series called Mastering the Scriptures. And as you'll learn, those are built on top of an understanding of the first principles in the story. As the name of the resources I'm talking about, which is our form of a modern day attempt at the Didache. And then what Kaiser was talking about, the promised plan, the meta-narrative, the one story that goes through the Bible. So on top of that, on top of the gospel and its teachings, the Didache, the root of how we should live, and God's meta-narrative, then we can begin, all of us, did they say all of us need to have degrees? No. It said all of us, no matter your station in life, no matter who you are, everyone, we are supposed to present them mature before Christ. They have to master their craft, says the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So no matter what your craft is, You have to master it. You have to put everything you have into that craft. I'm a farmer. I'm doing part of the time. My wife says I have 3 things I do, but you have to master that craft. I'm doing everything I can to be the best farmer that I can be, to take care of and steward the land that God has given us, and steward the plants on that land, and steward the machinery and people that God has given us to work there, everything. And it's the same way with the life work that God has given you. So, we as leaders in His church, we have to master the Scriptures. We have to master being an effective leader. And not just good leaders, but great leaders, which is why we take. So, and remember, we're trying to provide some just overall shape to this. So, mastering the Scriptures, that's what we're going to talk about now. And Jeff is going to bring us through these books, an overview of these booklets. Should I start introducing this, or when should I introduce this? You all are going to get these. You're not going to get them in these slipcovers, but we have copies of this. After this session is over, we have a hard copy for each of you to take. And so you will be getting all of Paul's early letters here, which includes Luke and Acts in here.
Why don't you explain why we are doing the slipcase?
Are you guys ready for that? I mean, thank you, Matt.
What'd you say?
I said, are you guys ready for that? I feel like I've talked a lot already. And the question you just threw at me.
I don't have it in the slides, is why I thought that, because I might forget it.
So in case Jeff forgets it.
Ask the question, what do you do with your first principles? They're on your shelf. They slip and slide, and some are curled. And
I thought you were going to give a theological answer. This is like, because I don't want the books to fall down.
But if you got them in a slipcase,
I'm going after big macro things, and you're going after books falling over.
I know, but it's cool. See, because if this is sitting on your shelf and you're doing your own body of work, and you put it back in, you're going to feel like this is your body of work. Not, where's that middle book? And it's, and then you'll be like Sam Schill, and it looks like your stuff's been run over by a truck, your books or something like that. But now you'll keep them nice, and you'll build your body of work.
There is in addition to them not falling over and having a body of work, there is I think the other reason, Jeff, that we're doing them this way,
Gospels.
Yeah, is because how do people view the New Testament letters? How do they view them? For example, in the paradigm, in the set of patterns in the way people think, if you say to a brand new believer, most Christians will say, what's the first book of the Bible that the brand new believers need to read? The Gospel of John. Or, second answer they may say is the Gospels. Why? Well, because that's what Jesus said. Jesus said that stuff. So it's kind of this much better than all the other letters. In fact,
and it's first.
If I'm translating the Bible, I'd kind of like to put that in red. And you can kind of see how you can kind of build on that. Now you got red letter editions. Okay, well, but why is that?
And
why is that?
And they're first in the New Testament.
Yeah. So we're not going to unpack all of the hermeneutical theological encyclopedia, but Kaiser began some of that work, and we're flourishing that into, when you look at as leaders in your churches, let me jump to leaders in your churches. You should be able to master the Scriptures. So you should know that Jesus didn't write Matthew. And what you should understand is that there are really 3 core sections of the New Testament. You have all of Paul's letters, and then Paul's co-worker like Luke and Acts. So you really need to group from a canonical, which simply means a grouping or clustering of letters together so that you can understand the author's intent, which is what Kaiser was talking about. You have to understand what the author is saying, inspired intentionally by the Spirit to leave these letters so that we can have them this many years later. Otherwise, we're chasing some other intent. And that's when you get, what did Kaiser say in his last, or in the beginning? You have a plethora of curriculum that might cause everything to be undone. And in fact, I think we're at the end of those days. Its impact is over. That's what his introduction paragraph is saying. So you have Paul's letters, and you have Luke Acts. Luke, of course, Luke Acts is really one volume. But he's part of Paul's team. And then you have Peter, and you have his whole circle of associates. And so you have, of course, James is with him, a brother of Jesus, led with a Gentile church in Jerusalem. You've got Jude in there. You got Hebrews, which is all written to the diaspora. Of course, we don't know exactly who wrote it, but it's all written. All those letters are all to the diaspora. Jude, if you read the beginning of all those letters, they all say, to the diaspora dispersed, to the dispersion amongst the Gentiles, it all uses that same language, which groups them together. And of course, Mark, the Gospel of Mark, John Mark, was with Paul, left, went with Peter, and was like Luke was to Paul, Mark was to Peter. But most people don't even know that when they read the Gospel of John Mark. And John Mark's Gospel itself is just you see Peter's 5 sermons in the book of Acts? If you just expand them like an accordion like this, that's how the Gospel of Mark, John Mark, wrote his Gospel, based off Peter's 5 sermons. So you can make sense of the whole entire Scriptures that make sense. And John, and then you have the Johannine literature. Of course, he's got John, he's got 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, he's got the book of Revelation. So it's all of John's literature. So, in addition to the books falling over, what we want you to do is be able to understand that Paul has a collection of letters. He has a whole corpus. And then these slipcases, we're not ready to provide them yet. So we're just giving you these books. But then you'll have Peter's, and then you'll have John's sitting right here. So some of our slides will be showing that. But that's a context of how and why they're ordered the way they are, they're written the way they are. At least it's categorized in here. Your turn.
This is the early, the later, and the middle, so that it's out of order.
For you guys, it's perfectly in order, right? Because it's right to left. No, that would be Hebrew, right to left.
Either way, it's out of order. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I didn't see I had the middle on the end. Okay. You have some slides. You're going to give us an orientation more in depth to this, yes? Let's do that.
And then Michael afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is teaching mastering the Scriptures.
Yeah, so this is a companion piece, like teaching the first principles. This is a comparable piece to that.
And then this one that Michael's going to show is a comprehensive assessment of apostolic networks and glossaries. So that comes out of this and is a tool then to use Paul's letters and the Gospels to assess your networks in your churches and how well they're established. And so that's what we're going to focus on right now.
Yep.
Here, this is yours. Sorry. Okay, shall I do it?
Yep.
Teaching mastering the Scriptures. Paul's traditioning process in establishing church networks, and I'm really going to just move quickly through these slides so that we've got interactive time and question times related to it, and then Michael will show you how to use the other tool built off of this. But when we say traditioning, what we mean is that as Paul describes himself, as be given a special stewardship to take the gospel to the Gentiles and to bring to light what is Christ's grand strategy. Through his letters, he talks about the apostles' teaching, the faith, the deposit, the sound doctrine, the authoritative traditions passed down. But in the context of that authoritative traditions, he has like his instructions on the Lord's Supper, where he calls it the authoritative traditions, and there's no other practice in the churches. So how do we go from Christ's design and his plan to Paul's articulation of that in his letters to then building our churches in that authoritative tradition? And so that's what we're talking about, the process of moving from those letters particularly to the practice in our networks of churches and in our individual churches. That's why you have an assessment guide that we're going to look at that allows you to be able to navigate all the way through Paul's letters and the Gospels and to be able to apply them to the assessment of your church networks. Okay, so actually teaching Mastering the Scriptures is going to become a complete set. There's Teaching Mastering the Scriptures, and then there's the bigger guide, which is Comprehensive Assessment of Apostolic Network Glossaries, and that you'll probably use annually as a top apostolic team to assess where your network's at and what things need to be worked on. And then they're all outlined, and we're starting this summer, and they'll be about a year each. Teaching Mastering the Scriptures Greek, Mastering Greek Linguistics, and then Teaching Mastering the Scriptures Hebrew, Mastering Hebrew Linguistics. And I'll show you the outline when we get there, but you go through that 6 weeks together with Logos, and you'll be able to work with Greek increasingly the rest of your life out of that 6-week period, and Hebrew as well. And 5 years down the road, those that learn classical languages in a theological institution, from the time they graduate, their Greek goes down. As soon as you learn this, in 6 weeks, yours will go up the rest of your life, because it fits with the whole system. This is another way of visualizing it. You got the first principles, and then Mastering the Scriptures. Now, there's a biblical bridge to this, because Paul talks about everybody needing to learn the first principles of the faith, and so also the Hebrews author. But then later, Paul talks about the fact that, Timothy, you're now a master craftsman in 1st and 2nd Timothy. But continue lifelong to work hard at the preaching and teaching and making sure that your progress is evident to everyone. So the system is designed to say, okay, this is basically where Timothy was at when Paul said that, even though the letters weren't of it. I mean, they were just getting all collected, at that point. But that's where Timothy was at. But the point is, they need to be designed so that you're in lifelong process. And that's how the thing is put together, and you'll see that at the end of this. And we're in the process right now of the Petrine Circle and Johannine, and I think those will be done about next year at this time. At the conference, we'll be able to finish that off, hopefully. And we've also designed all the way through the Old Testament. So we're going to do it in reverse. This is the writings, Psalms, and wisdom literature, and the writings as a whole, and former prophets, latter prophets, and then Law, Genesis, and Deuteronomy. We're not doing everything, but this is the heart of it all. And we're partially doing it in reverse because all of these tools, I don't know if you know, Life to the End, Identifying, Becoming, Parenting with a Plan, Artisanship, and Shepherding Counseling, are basically built out of the wisdom literature. And so this will give you a deeper understanding if we prioritize first the writings. This is the outline for Teaching Mastering the Scriptures. Session 1 is the new perspective on Paul, rethinking Western hermeneutics. When you really get the idea of Paul's role and responsibility and that he's a coherent thinker, and you start there, and therefore then you start in the church, It's a totally different approach to hermeneutics. And Kaiser's talking and challenging us in the end of that to be taking this forward, because it will really shape the future. And he actually, one of his journal articles is the coming revolution. It was in Concordia, Lutheran Seminary, was the coming need for a complete revolution in hermeneutics. And so we talk about this. Then canonical structure and the new perspective of Paul. That's what Michael was talking about. What's the order you study these things in? You can study them anywhere, obviously, but in any order. But when you're laying the foundations, canonical structure. Paul's traditioning process, schematic setting for setting churches in order. In other words, how do you set churches in order, and how do you structure ministries that are consistent with that traditioning process, rather than Western institutional programs? And then process for doing theology and culture with the grand strategy schema. Paul had a grand strategy of his early, middle, and later letters. It's situated into the book of Acts. So how do you actually do theology? He's doing theology in 1 Corinthians when he says all these divisions. He doesn't cover all the possible issues, but he shows the real divisions in community and in the gathering. And then, for example, Colossians, he deals then with Philemon and the slavery issue. All those are to teach us how to do theology in our cultural situation, how to be flexible, but on a solid base. And so that's what that one is about. Paul's tools for building complex apostolic networks. We also took here and we said, okay, here's the framework of the apostolic network, the complex apostolic network, but when you look carefully at all 1 Corinthians 16, Romans 16, and you look at all the comments he makes, you look at the narrative and how it's put together in Acts, you begin to see how he puts together the network in far more detail. And so we put it all together and put it in an assessment guide. And then the new perspective on Paul and the Gospels, because the Gospels come mostly after Paul's writings. And so they were writing in light of that. We know it even from Peter, where he talks about Paul's whole collection, of letters, and it's difficult to understand them. And then we look at mastering, teaching, and mastering the Scriptures. That's where we deal with the 7 grandmothers. So remind me to be sure I deal with the 7 grandmothers at that time. Then there's an appendix where we have a comprehensive assessment of complex apostolic networks, a Greco-Roman research library, and then a glossary of key terms and concepts. And we'll come back to that a little bit. Okay, what I'm going to do is just look at one slide on each session. I can't, just to kind of help you get the flow. Not really anticipating that some of it you'll be able to understand without getting into it. But there's a core set of hermeneutical concepts. These aren't exact steps for each culture, and they're based on the fact of author's intent, literary design, biblical theology, theology and culture. But here we take and look at things more in advance from kind of developing a hermeneutical community. A new hermeneutic, Paul is a coherent thinker, not a systematic theologian. Topoi as clustering, overarching subsections, asides, like the pastoral epistles. The organizing center is the church as a family of families, and establish the church as a family of families. Older men, older women, younger men, younger women, older women help the younger women, care for the widows, and the elders that are supposed to do a good job in their own household before they lead the household of God. So it's a structure of the family of families. That's an overarching topoi clustering. So topoi is a term that's used for integrated topics, not just isolated topics, but integrated topics into the argument of the author that have an overarching sometimes, or entire subsection collections, or just asides. And you'll learn how to do that in there. Apostolic traditioning of Paul. We don't build traditional programs, but we go from schema to principles to processes to practice. 1 Corinthians 11:17 to 14:40 is the gathering. And when you look at that whole structure, you've got you've got the schema, which is the gathering. You've got principles in chapter 12 and 13 that inform that structure as a whole. Then you've got the processes and practices of the Lord's Supper itself and the guidelines for the meeting. So you actually can look at Paul's pattern and use that to be able to take the scriptures that you've interpreted and put them into practice in biblical ways in building our ministries. And then no theology of Paul, documents, papers, documents, culture. Nobody can write a theology of Paul all the way through. Paul did his letters situationally so that you can start with that foundation and then reason it out in your cultural setting. And so we take you through that set of hermeneutics. Then session 3, Paul's traditioning process, schematic for setting churches in order. Apostolic traditioning of Paul today, from schema to principles to processes to practice. Greek rhetoric, schematic, topos, topoi, like the family of families, virtueless, and viceless, literary design theology. In other words, your theology, when you understand the literary design, your theology actually goes in chunks. So when you get that large or small, that piece, then that becomes the building block. So you're building out from the theological intent of the author in that design. And that's where linguistics is going, by the way, why it's so important. We'll have you clear out on the cutting edge of linguistics with the Greek and Hebrew part that will follow. And then the codifying framework, I can't go into that. That doesn't make sense on the surface, but it's really important. And then we have a thing in there of assessing networks using that process. So let's go through the network. Let's go through how well they're established, but let's also look at the ministries. Because what happens is you develop a whole new framework in the paradigm, but you got a bunch of, you're dragging a bunch of ball and chain with your old programs. And you can't knock them in the head because a third of the people will leave. So you're stuck with those things, but they all got to be evaluated and restructured. Then an example, there's not time for this. And then session 5 is Paul's letters as tools for building complex networks. We look at the complex network, then we look all the way through the materials and say, how do you go, let's look at all the problems that Paul dealt with, tracing all of his ways that not only he solved problems, but he strategized, and then evaluate your complex network in light of where the holes are. And then session 7, did I just skip one? 5. Ooh, that's not good. Where's 6? What's 6, Michael, in 6? New perspective on the Gospels. Oh, I just didn't have, there it is, 6. Jeez, somebody help the boy. Session 6, the new perspective on Paul and the Gospels. So what this is this is like chunking. Again, this is like that literary design, and you say, what are the key pieces? Lots of smaller things can be learned, but you got to start with the building blocks that the author is building. So you can go through this in one look, and you can say, well, Matthew's structured sermon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Luke, you've got plan phase 1 Luke, plan phase 2 Acts. You look at the basic ideas in the upper room discourse. And so from there, you turn it into questions and do assessments, because these were tools to establish churches too. Okay, enough. And then the last session, mastering, teaching, and using mastering the scriptures. Who needs to go through mastering the scriptures? And we have this argument all the time with every group all around the world that says, you don't know how dumb my people are in this culture. They can't learn this stuff. And particularly if they're illiterate, they're really stupid people. and they can't think, even though they can think better in an integrated way than most people that have now a filing cabinet brain as a result of going to Western education. And you know that Paul wrote, how in the world, see all the orality literature, I could just get off on this so long, but all the orality literature that comes from the West and we feed the movements overseas is, now just take these dumb people and all you need to do is give them 50 stories or 100 stories. And we've done this. We've studied movements. We studied one group that has 2,000 elders and went through the whole system, and they couldn't think their way out of a paper box. But they could tell those stories because the stories weren't tied to the author's intent, and they couldn't get the ideas. But you realize that Paul wrote Romans, which is pretty tough, to an audience of 85% non-literate. And out of the dialogue and community, they get it. And he expected them to get it. He didn't say, this is for some of you guys, those of you that are the 85%, listen and pick up a little now and then rely on them for understanding Romans. The whole thing has to be rethought. Apostolic leaders need to go through this. They obviously have to go through it at the beginning because they're going to train the senior elders like Titus 1, who have to have a firm grasp of the teaching, remember? And can think on their feet in an assembly meeting and refute those who contradict. So then you need elders, deacons, and leading women, especially senior elders getting that. Then you need ministry leaders taking care to align their ministries with the way of Christ and the apostles. Do parents need to learn this? Bring your children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. When kids are 12 to 18, and then they're really adults at 16, if you look at it practically speaking, with tough questions. And our method in the U.S. primarily is, they got some tough questions. Let's make sure we keep dropping them off in Sunday school because somebody will answer their question. The parents need to be able to think biblically in culture. And every believer, I'll illustrate that at the end. Remember to talk about the 7 grandmothers. 2 times, yeah. Okay, then you've got 3 appendixes. One is a comprehensive assessment of the networks, and Michael's going to go through that. So we yanked out of the book these assessment sections, and we put it all in one spot so you can take that and use it to assess your church or churches. The guide is the Pauline Corpus Network Assessment Guide, the Gospels Network Assessment Guide, types of issues and problems Paul addressed and solved them as a pattern. And actually, when you go through all of them that he solved, like all of them in 1 Corinthians, and you look at the different ones spread across his letters, there's quite a few problems that are just there in every generation, in every culture. So it moves you down the road. Then the second half is Greco-Roman Annotated Research Library, and this is where you can learn to use Greek and Hebrew 6 weeks each. And then the Appendix 3 is glossaries, biblical terms and concepts, a huge glossary. Paul's letters, first of all, and so you have the glossary for Paul's early letters, which is the Gospels. Then next to it you have the glossary for his middle letters, then for pastorals, because they all have different terminology as it grows, and then the one for the Gospels. So you can be looking at the assessment of Paul's middle letters, and right there is all the main concepts, because the glossary is a topos-based topic statement. It kind of a 2-3 line small paragraph of each of these ideas that's absolutely consistent with what grew out of the texts themselves. And then you have the Gospels. Then you have technical hermeneutics for 3 or 4 pages for some of the terms. That's the new encyclopedia or lexicon. For paradigm. And then it seems like a waste, but then you have all the glossaries integrated. And people say, you could just do them one integrated. No, I want you thinking all the biblical concepts in Paul's early letters when you're evaluating the early letters. But you got to be able to find them anywhere, so you need them, as a whole. And then, so if you take the comprehensive guide here then, part 1 and 2, we yanked, this were the appendix in the book. All right, then we took and yanked appendix 1 and 3 out and made them into this large booklet. So you can evaluate, take another one in the future and evaluate, but you've still got them integrated in the appendixes to the main piece, so you can keep, going over that and teaching it and developing your own hermeneutic. And then we're back to, again, the idea of the first principles to mastering the scriptures. This is the pathway that Paul sent. Now, think about type 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what used to be called Leadership Mastery 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we're calling it Master Craftsman. It's really developed. Tomorrow you're going to see it, part of the core of my paper, and then our discussion afterwards on it. But generally speaking, Master Craftsman 1, First Principles 1 and 2, and the Life Development Series, Life to the End, Identifying Who You're Designed to Be, and Parenting with a Plan. Then the second level is First Principles Series 3, Life Development Series, Becoming Who You Were Designed to Be, Artisanship and the Lifelong Pursuit of Wisdom, and Teaching the First Principles and Teaching the Story. So that's the beginning of your hermeneutic. Master Craftsman 3, MTS Collections. Same in 4, MTS Collections. We're not saying 3 is the New Testament and 4 is the Old Testament, and this is the exact order you got to go in. But when you really see it, like what Michael's got set up there, there's a logical process to studying the Paul's early, middle, and later letters, letting the first 2 Gospels fit towards the end of that, studying the Petrine and taking 2 more and put there, and then putting John in the Johannine. Somewhat the order they were written, somewhat the context they were written. You can use the stuff all over the place. In fact, with all these detailed glossaries, you can take every section, every session of every book all the way through here, we've turned it into a question for evaluation. But then you can go right to the outline of all of the books, and so you can say, here's the issue. Now over here, you check it off, and here's the session you need to go to do your own study in the process, so that the whole thing is integrated, which makes it also a shepherding counseling tool. Because you can jump in and start seriously on a passage of Scripture, and then as you begin to work, you bump them over into the same process that everybody is in, and so it'll make it usable at every level. Then teaching, mastering the Scriptures there, and that's a heavy lift, the one we're looking at here, and the encyclicals. Master Craftsman 4, MTS Collections again, but then teaching, mastering the Scriptures, mastering Greek linguistics, teaching, mastering the Scripture, mastering Hebrew linguistics, and now the white papers that I'm starting and the global dialogues that we get 2 of Michael's during this time. So that sets the path of continuing the paradigm work at a higher level. So here you've got teaching, mastering the Scriptures, then your guide, and then in the future you've got teaching, mastering the Scriptures Greek, mastering Greek linguistics, and Hebrew, mastering Hebrew linguistics. So actually the outline for this is you're going to memorize the alphabet, accents, alphabet, accents, and punctuation, and really basic linguistics. So you got to memorize the alphabet and how to say the word. So you're not saying, tell me again, Walt, about continuity. No, you got to at least pronounce it right and find it. But beyond that, everything's at a touch of the button on the Logos exegetical thing that it does for you. But you got to learn how to use that. So then canonical intertextuality, I mean, even Wycliffe, it just drives me nuts because I've argued for years that classical Greek, the way they learned it in seminaries, it just does not stick. But when you learn it functionally as you're building it, you grow up with it. But then linguistics comes along with Wycliffe, and that's right. You need to come at it from a linguistic standpoint, but they've turned it into a kind of detailed exercise that you can't see the forest for the trees. And in China, in our situation, even though we paid for it, they can't even use the Wycliffe translations. And I believe you start exactly the other way. The people that are doing the translating, they have to have canonical intertextuality and the subsections, know what's really going on in Paul's middle letters. And then you've got to do literary design of the books and discourse analysis. I need to take that out. It's not, discourse analysis is at the root of it, but this is much different. Then semantical range of words and phrases, topos-based topic statements. And then platinum logos, the research messages and papers. So the idea is we help you lay the biblical theology foundation, then you're going to build on that with research, with messages, with papers, books in the future that build out of it. So you're getting that body of literature in your culture. And then mastering Greek linguistics, how to build that into lifetime study habits. Same thing then in teaching, mastering the scriptures. So really what's happening is, you remember the fourth paradigm paper, maybe it's the third, where I'm talking about hermeneutics, and that goes all the way back to Kaiser's article, that authors single intent, literary design, that's right out of the Antiochian tradition. But then I talk about the fact that Gadamer's work, if you remember Hans Gadamer, Truth and Method, what's going to get you to a more accurate place? Training an individual to be a scientist and exegete for everybody else, or training everybody with basic hermeneutical principles in community, leaders in community who hover around an issue together and work it through. And so I talk about building a hermeneutical community. And so, believe it or not, this is radically different than how hermeneutics is taught. And it's actually as part of the challenge that Kaiser gave us in that last paragraph. You know, somebody got to take this out and change the whole system. Well, you get how to teach the first principles, you're starting there to be able to interpret. So that's enough that if you're a senior elder, like in Titus 1, you can get the principles of the faith down and reason them in the practice of putting the stuff in your own words in the dialogue and think on your feet. Teaching the story now picks up how you can even teach one whole chapter on teaching oral learners and the importance of the story of it. Now we're doing some heavy lifting with the teaching, mastering the scriptures, but only for the purpose of mastering the scriptures so you can use these letters particularly, or the wisdom literature, for example, for the life development base in establishing our churches and believers. And then you've got the Greek and Hebrews on the other side of it. Okay, this I just did. Writing, editing, and publishing was not easy in 1983. This is our original. We had to refinance our house. The first IBM, no hard drive. They convinced us you never need a hard drive. All right, you'll never have that much information. And a daisy wheel printer, and a copier you can't see, and then two screens. One of them's monochrome and one of them's black and white. $7,500. In those days, we had to refinance our home just to be able to do the first India booklets. But I put this in here, and she'll kill me. But this is my wife editing in 1983. This is my wife editing in 2023. Now, if we didn't have the team that Michael's put together, 7 people, from the time Nancy finishes the third edit to it going out to our team, 7 people touch. And this whole thing that you're getting goes right through our engine, and they were over there early this morning, just in time delivery, to finish that off. Josh has overseen that. James does all the loading. There's a whole system that's built. But we would not be sitting here having these tools if it wasn't for my wife. Okay, that's it. And besides that, Michael said it well, he and I are both kind of difficult to live with. Can you imagine that? And there's nothing I want to do less than go back a third time over these things and answer some of these detailed questions that Nancy has. So, she almost has to find the right time. It's not that bad. Sometimes it's that bad. Okay. What do we do next? We're going to talk, or are you going to do the glossary? Or
Well, you said we're kind of difficult to live with. I would just say we are difficult to live with. That would be the only adjustment. I think maybe, Jeff, and everyone, a comment to make at the end of this is to say, if you don't see a problem out in the world with the way leadership training or the way developing all your people and all your churches, that the existing paradigm says you're supposed to do it with whatever curriculum you want and in any way you want, and in personal Bible devotions every morning with you and just you and Jesus? If you don't see an issue and a problem with that theological encyclopedia, then what we're talking about doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter because you don't really see a problem with it. You just, our people are, I hear it a lot, our people are just we need it easier. So if you don't see a problem, then everything we've said is kind of moot. It just doesn't matter. So I just want to make that point to you all. You have to really, that's why we started with the paradigm stuff yesterday. That's why we started with paradigm curves. For you to understand that there is a problem in our world today, and there is a problem in Christianity. Because a lot of people just write curriculum however they want, and a plethora of it is out there in our world today. So you first have to have in your mind that there actually is a problem. And then you have to go on a long journey in order to understand what that new solution may be. So that's the first thing to say, because I think that's a place to start. Everyone has this now. I want you to open up this. I'm going to take you through this.
Wait, Lee, you got your own slides?
No, I'm not going to use slides.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the table of contents that has the page, because we don't actually have a table of contents.
Jeff, you use your clicker and go back.
I'm changing my computer, thinking what's wrong? It's stuck.
Good, it's stuck. And what I want to put in your mind while Jeff is getting that for you,
there it
is you need to establish your church. You are responsible for establishing your church, and you are responsible for establishing your church network. You have to believe that to be true too. There's so many parachurches out there, and so many entities, organizations out there that they say, what we want is we want a relationship with you. But here's the thing, relationships don't last past your death. And a lot of relationships don't last past certain conflicts. So relationships is we need relationships, but understand that what we're talking about in there is there's a deposit that is of wisdom and of truth that passes on past ourselves. And that's the depth of we are responsible to handing that deposit into another person's heart, into our people's hearts. So again, you have to have that into your mind. So open this up. Go to page 1. And what you see right away, let me give you a quick example of a topos-based topic statements. Right there, what you see is a quick chart that shows Paul's early letters, Paul's middle letters, and Paul's later letters. What a topos is, it's a central argument that everything else is built around. It's the core argument. It's what Kaiser talks about as that mountaintop in the whole promised plan of God. And so all of us, when you read any of the early letters, what you should be thinking in the back of your mind is Romans 16, that he's trying to establish them in my gospel, he says. Well, why is he saying my gospel? He's saying Paul's gospel isn't the gospel of Jesus Christ? Because there is that debate that Jeff was talking about the gospel. And in Galatians, Paul says he had to rebuke Peter himself in his face. He had to rebuke him to his face about the gospel, about the clarity of the gospel. So, yeah, it's strong in the gospel. And Romans 16, 25 to 27 is really the topos argument there. Paul's middle letters, of course, Ephesians 3, 8 through 10, the mystery that's been revealed. The later letters, the topos is 1 Timothy 3, 14 and 15, that the church is if I may delay, you know how you ought to behave in the household, the family of families, which is the household of God. Okay, so that's what topos-based topics are. You have to have those things in your head. If you go to the next page, Then you see the literary design of those whole canonical sections. And why is literary design important? So you have what Walter Kaiser says is you have to chase the author's intended meaning. You have to chase it, and so you get the intended meaning from what's called the topos there. That's the core argument around. But then you have the literary design, which is the written design of how their argument unfolded in the letters. Now, these are situational letters. He doesn't just give us a checklist, but it's situational. And so you look at this, the literary design, and you see it starts with the gospel itself, the gospel message. And quite frankly, that's where 99% of all parachurch mission organizations stop, right there. Just give them the tract, give them the salvation, give them to repeat it, and you're done. But that's not where the apostles' letters stop. So you continue on down that left column, and you see that there's actually a gospel formula, and then you see in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians that Paul is trying to affirm and confirm that their conversion is actually complete. He's actually following up with the gospel message and the sermons, you may call them, from Peter, and he's following up and he's saying, are you sure you've got it? I see you're leaving and you're doing something else. Don't get distracted by other things in this world. So he begins to go through making sure about solid conversion. Then he goes through and he says, guess what? There's going to be a whole bunch of schisms, a whole bunch of things that are going to come at you. Then he goes in and says, you know what? You're probably going to put this into a religious form. 1 Corinthians 14, 1 through 40. He says, you're probably going to do don't get caught up in religious activity and religious acts that seem religious but aren't actually building the body up. And quite frankly, that's exactly what Western Christendom is. It's a modified mass system that we do every morning, every Sunday morning. And people say, well, we can't get rid of it. We have to have it. Well, it's religious ceremony. So, and that's all. And then a perspective of ministry, Paul's treatise of the whole gospel in Romans, and then the Pauline cycle as far as recognizing these gatherings or assemblies of believers that are having a meal on the first day of the week, celebrating their new life in Christ. So, you can go down through Paul's middle letter there and see his arguments in Paul's later letters.
Let me add a thought into
role,
that, Michael, when you get a chance. If you take that chart that he's looking at there, another way of, when you say literary design, another way of saying is that the literary design gives you chunks, and the literary design contains, a theology, like a framework of the theological ideas. Like the second column there is household texts, husbands, wives, parents, children, master, slaves. There's a literary chunk of those household texts there, and in Colossians and in Peter. So when you identify those chunks, or they could be bigger ones like the gathering hunk, from 11 through 14, but you take something like that and you add those together and they stand out and they frame the biblical theology idea, and you look at those as a whole, then you actually can see across those the important chunks of ideas that he's using to establish the church networks all at one time. So on the gospel one, you can see all the way across the core elements of what it means to use those 6 letters to establish them in the gospel before you get into detail on each one of the questions per session.
Yeah.
It's another way of saying that.
I feel compelled to tell you just a moment here. When I was 15 years old, my grandmother had taught me the faith while we worked on the farm. She would get us up early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, get us up. She had this gray Caprice Classic with the hood as big as a boat, a trunk as big as a boat. But we would go to Casey's, and she would get me these glazed donuts right when they would open at 5 o'clock, and I just have fond memories of that. But I would learn and she taught me, while we were scooping manure, is what we did. The job had to be done. every morning. The animals never stopped doing it. And she would teach me the Bible. She would tell me stories of the Bible. And she said to me, I remember one time in particular, she said, you leaders are really important for the church. She loved Rahab, who was a terrible leader. She was the wife of Ahaz, the terrible king. But she said the woman was powerful. She was a leader for evil. But if you're going to, Michael, you need to be a leader. And you can be a good leader. But if you're going to be a great leader, you're going to have to actually wrestle with what the Bible actually says. That stuck with me. Because when I was 15, I gave a public commitment of my faith in front of the whole church. I met with the elders. I made a public commitment to it. And I repeated that phrase to the elders, and I said, I'm committing my life to do what the Bible says. Now, I didn't know at the time that you don't know what you're saying in some senses at the time, but I look back on that. For whatever reason, I remember that. I don't remember all the things that my brother and my younger sister accused me of, but I do remember those. God puts these markers in your life to remind you of what he's doing. And so I'll tell you, when I first saw this, and when we first started talking about this and dialoguing about this, I said, we have a stewardship to establish people in the faith, to present them mature. And this is such a useful tool to follow the apostles, the Bible's intention and design on how to do it. Is it complex? Is it difficult? Is it a whole lot newer and different than anything Yeah, it is. It's really, really difficult in that sense. But it's true to the author. So if you go to page 3, what it begins to do is it takes the first question is the overarching topos, which means it's the overarching thrust or core argument of the early letters, and it asks you that question in basic form. And then it takes each letter after that and chunks it out and asks you the same question in question form that the author himself is asking them. It's a very simple design. Overall, this is what the author is saying, and then each chunk. So, for example, let's look at Paul's early letters. Are our churches, and again, this is not you are responsible for your churches and these churches. It's not just a Sunday morning event, and it's not just a relationship that you just text back and forth. You're responsible to present them mature before Christ. Our churches and networks are fully established in the gospel, marked by a solid conversion, by a community-wide unity modeled at the weekly gathering. Are they marked by a full understanding of the gospel fought for by Paul in the Romans letter, free from man-made traditions and consistent with the simple gospel formula delivered to Paul by the apostles in Jerusalem? Galatians, are there any signs of deserting the gospel in our churches, or more specifically, embracing another gospel that actually distorts the gospel in a way that makes it different gospel or altered gospel from the one delivered to them by Paul? And so you can keep going through each of them. So you see on page 4, if you turn the page, you've got Thessalonians, you've got Corinthians, and we say the Corinthian letters and then put a 1 behind it just to give you the idea that it's the letter, we call it 1 Corinthians, but it's actually the second letter that was written, but it's the Corinthian letters. And then you have the Corinthian letters number 2, and then you have Romans. So we actually are putting them for you in the order in which they were most likely in which they were written as well. So what you can do is, as I've done this when I traveled last time to India, I went and afterwards I took this assessment and I filled it out for each of the networks I was with. I filled it out. And then I cried. Because we got a lot of work to do. But what you can do, man. What you can do, one more thought, Jeff, is if they're not doing well on whatever one it is, let's say it's the second one in Galatians, you say not doing well, that corresponds to Galatians in the second one in here. So it's not like you got to say, well, Olger, here you go. You're not doing well on that one. Here you go. I mean, it corresponds to all of them. If I can find Galatians, it corresponds to, these slipcovers are amazing. I wish they just wouldn't slip all over. I was making fun of you there.
I didn't hear it. I missed it. Sorry.
It's not quite as fun. It corresponds to every session in the book. That's all my point is.
So it kind of corresponds with your joke. After the joke, you let him know he's making fun of me. After he makes fun of me, he has to let me know that he was just making fun of me. So
I didn't hear anybody laugh.
So who does that reflect on? That actually reflects on me.
Yeah, it does. Exactly.
Here, the piece you got to see. Let's say you're on that Galatians page on 3, and number 3, our churches haven't picked up that there's a whole new way of life like that Didache, and you say,
which page are you on? I'm on
page 3.
Page 3.
The third one in Galatians.
Third one in Galatians.
So then you flip over to page 12.
Page 12.
And after you've gone through all those evaluations, sure enough, Galatians, so quickly leaving the gospel, second from the top on page 12. And then you go down to session 3, it's the gospel as a system of living. So in other words, the question evaluates, do they know there's a system of living? Are they established in it? And so then...
No, but I know the gospel.
So these are...
I know the gospel message. I can repeat it to you.
Yeah, but not session 3.
Oh.
So you can go down here then, and these exactly parallel. So they're drawn out of the books themselves, the passages of the session, and then you go over and check this. So when you go through the whole thing, you say, these are all pretty good. You get to the third one in Romans, and wow, that's a big problem. You got a division over that. So then go directly over here to Romans and check that box. Yeah. So when you're done, you got a few check marks of where the problems are. Actually, you don't have check marks. I think it's didn't we put that?
Doing well, not doing well, doing okay, and doing terrible.
Yeah, doing well, slight problem, major problem.
Slight problem, major problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's room for comments in it. So this actually becomes a tool for annually or whatever doing a really thorough assessment of where your churches are.
Yeah. Let's take a few questions now. Let's take a few questions. I was talking to a guy the other day and talking to him about this, and he said, "Oh, I can go to the bookstore. There's lots of books on Ephesians. But again, the reason we started with Walt Kaiser, because if you don't understand the biblical theology, author's intent, and literary design, then this is just another curriculum. You got to understand where its roots are.
There are books out there like Kaiser's and Elliot Johnson's, and some of the new linguistic stuff that we're building in is in this tradition of where hermeneutics should go. But when it comes down to bringing that down into something like these booklets and a method that the booklets are consistent with, there's nothing in that hermeneutic out there as far as small booklets that do that.
Yeah.
Nothing. They're all inductive Bible study, outline-ish on books, topic-oriented in terms of inside the books, and coming from an individual learning of the Bible knowledge standpoint, not really from what the letters were really intended to be, tools in establishing churches.
Learning in their gatherings, learning in their communities, learning with each other. They're a hermeneutical community. That's the point. It's not a personal Bible study. All right, who's got the mic? Sony? You were telling me yesterday that there is no Western influence in India.
I mean, there is not as much as it is in America.
Oh, that's right.
There is
that's right.
influence, definitely. Yeah, there is definitely influence, but not so much the paradigm as in it's here. Okay, now my question is, in the theological encyclopedia that you created, you put first principles and then you put the story after that, and then you further on into the Pauline corpus. Now, even the apostles, when they preached the kerygma, they referred a lot to the Old Testament. Peter's sermon, everything was embedded in the Old Testament itself. So, don't you think, or at least that's what I think, that story should come first in the encyclopedia, in the theological encyclopedia, so that they get some basic foundation of the Old Testament, and then you can take the first principles on further from there.
Well,
do you think that makes sense, or you still
No.
think first principles should come first?
No.
Okay. Why?
Oh, okay.
That was good, Sony. Completely redeemed yourself.
What they did not encounter the whole, well, first of all, the front of the booklet has session 1 and 2, where you've got the walkthrough, and then you've got all the books and how they fit into the story, and then you've got the passages, those first 2 sessions. That's a great tool for non-believers, to work with. So we're not saying you teach the story after the first principles. I've got them up there, but most of the examples of what we use is teach the story maybe after series 1. And then you say, well, why would you do that? Well, the story demands a lot of work to understand it. And the Jewish audience, even the Jewish audience, they did not go back. Peter did not go back and draw on the whole Bible, teach them Genesis. They did not teach them the whole thing. That what they did was they explained the gospel clearly, like session 1 of book 1 of the first principles. That's exactly what Peter's sermon was in a short form at Cornelius' house. And then, as they expanded that gospel, they drew on some key passages, in the Old Testament and drew them forward. When they were addressing the Jewish audience that knew the whole Old Testament, like Stephen, they did the whole thing. So what I'm saying is that the most evidence you have is that Paul right away got them established in the first principles of faith, and then unfolded the story. So actually, when you go through series 1 of the first principles, you are piece by piece putting the story together. But the story is written as a very thorough tool. But if you take the front 2 and then just verbally go through in an interactive way the passages, I did 25 walkthroughs when we were starting our churches back in the 70s. And a lot of our people, Jay, where you at? Jay back in the corner is one of our senior elders in 1978, went through the walkthrough, and he was a skeptical teacher. But when he saw the whole story fit together, he went after it. So I'm saying that don't wait till the end, but if you're going to take that story book and you're going to pile everybody through those passages in depth before they have the first principles of the faith, then they're going to get lost, and the teachers are going to wind up teaching it more like Bible knowledge, type of thing. So I think you get the principles in situation and decide when to unfold the story. But I'm not saying unfold it at the end. It may seem like it, but that's not really what I mean.
We have an example in the, I was going to talk to you about in the Muslim countries, how they've been using that, and especially how the story helps put remnants and pieces of the story that they have. They start with Abraham, but they jump then all the way to their story. They have aspects of the land in there, but it jumps all the way to Muhammad in the story, in their story. But when they bring God's story in, it actually fills in all the gaps. And it's a powerful, powerful
and
tool.
So if you look at the Gentile example of Peter's 5 sermons, without a lot of knowledge of the Old Testament, he gave it in nugget form in verses 34 to 48, which is exactly series 1, book 1. And then Matthew says, go, baptize, and teach. So you go, most of the Acts examples were going and getting it solid baptizing them right away and letting them know there's a teaching. So at least you get that framework in place. Then you've got to determine when you bring the story in. They defended the gospel that they were delivering in that fashion by going back and drawing on the Old Testament. But there is a certain base that has to be there to be able to go back, and draw on it. And how much needs to be there, I don't know. But I tell you, you get that first process of those first 4 books in place, so they understand. There's basically go baptize, teach, a teaching. You're part of a family of families. You get into it, and hey, there's a mission, that we're part of, and you get those quick building blocks in. Then you may want to put the story, but also I narrated it in there, and we should do just a simple version of the walkthrough, because they memorize by people being in a circle and all kinds of hand gestures and everything else that's included in there. They memorize the story, like Kaiser was doing, those 4 mountains, those passages, backbones, and then into the New Testament and the story after that. So doing
We'll do a
the
video
light
on it.
version makes sense, but not that book.
At some point, we'll do a video on it and post it up. All right, one more question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael and Jeff. I'm Robert from Uganda. I'm wondering the approach you would use. Would you start with first doing the comprehensive assessment, then you do the teaching, or you first teach, then you assess?
Well,
Talking about leaders?
yeah, who's the audience? And what do they? It's a theological encyclopedia question, but you're asking what should they study. Our follow-up question to you is who? Who is it first?
You have a network of church leaders.
A network of church leaders, and are they? I would work down. Are they solid in the gospel? Are they solid in their conversion? Do they know there's a new way of life? And then don't answer those now, but you have to start to do they know the first principles of the faith? That's the essence of my questions, my 3 or 4 questions there. Because if they have that base, then you can move on to what we're talking about.
But as far as ordered learning, let's say you're building a senior eldership, I would take them through the mastering the scriptures, and then early on when you've got a couple, 3 leaders that are rising and say, man, these guys are going to be able to teach this, or gals, then I would do a smaller cohort and work through teaching the mastering the scriptures with them. Teaching mastering the scriptures is very, very important, but it's top shelf. I mean, you've got to be motivated by what's going on in your study of mastering the scriptures to go through that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what I've done so far in using these tools, Robert, is, and everyone, this will be a transition to this afternoon after the lunchtime. But we're going to talk to Philip from France, and we've started actually with 2 Timothy as a little bit of a lead-in, but that's because we're beginning to want a team globally of apostolic leaders that are beginning to think for their whole civilization and for the whole globe. And 2 Timothy is a direct hit on, you just read this and you'll see the direct hit of the sessions, but it's essentially that there is a deposit and there is a role of leaders who stir amongst networks of churches. There is an actual role for them. And there's actually specific work that they do in building networks of churches. And so we're bringing that group through 2 Timothy in particular, and then...
There's another way of answering your question, too, and that is if you're going to use mastering the scriptures. And by the way, they're twice the length of the first principles. So most of them are about 160 pages, longer readers, longer commentary. But if you're going to have a group teach it, 3 or 4 teachers or yourself, I would work through teaching mastering the scriptures, actually before you start teaching it. So you've got the scope and sequence of the whole thing, and you've got additional work on the hermeneutic down.
We're going to have to, what became obvious, Jeff and our whole team, what became obvious here, we're going to begin to equip you in using these more and more. Right now, our role is just to introduce it to you and give you the scope. So it's a great follow-up question, because you're really asking, how do we equip others? How do I equip my leaders? How do I equip my churches? And we're going to have to do much more equipping around that.
And one of the questions, one of the questions.
That was the end.
What's that?
That was the end. Go ahead.
The end of our meeting?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, what's this do to the leadership series? Because right now you've got the leadership series, the Old Testament is all we have, so you have to use that till we get the Old Testament done. But I've said all along for the years, even though it's a huge investment of my life in the leadership series, a year per series, and there's 32 books on the average. I mean, in the whole series, those big notebooks. I've said all along they're crutches. You know, they get us moving the right direction. And they'll still be useful for research or maybe for some the highest level, but this has all the time. You get into that Greco-Roman library, and it's all of it is in. I forgot to talk about that. So all of it is in Logos. Almost every book in the Greco-Roman library that's back there. And so when you take together the questions that you have and the method I give you on the glossary, and we'll expand on the Greek and Hebrew ones too, you can do exhaustive work on any subject yourself, higher than you would get out of the leadership series. And the other question I forgot, I told you twice to remind me of the 7 grandmothers. The 7 grandmothers. Bill Burns.
We have plenty of time. Why don't you tell us about the 7 grandmothers?
Why don't what? Oh, yeah. Oh, thanks. Bill Burns and Don Johnson, who's one of our senior elders, and Bill Burns led their church through all the way through the Gospels, and then all the way through the third set, the later letters of Paul. And the 7 grandmothers, a couple of them that were new to the church and fairly new to the faith, actually. The 7 grandmothers did papers and work all the way through those 2 collections. Good work all the way through those 2. Now there's a time when they're saying, a couple of them were saying, well, what am I got to study 2 Timothy for? This is about how to establish a Paul-like Timothy type person. Say, well, are you a grandmother? What about
Yep, I am.
Timothy's framework? Were you a mother, or do you have? In other words, who influenced Timothy at the
Lois.
foundation and with parents?
Cornelia.
So the point is, you can do the work if you're motivated to do the work. And if you have to decide you can't do the work because it's too hard, then the problem is with the teacher, not with the person's capacity to do that. We have one example of a non-literate lady in Leadership Mastery 2 with 100 women under her, in Leadership Mastery 1, all of them non-literate. You know, so these are skillful tools. These are powerful tools if you have a skillful teacher. But if you can't handle the whining and complaining until you get people shaped up and working, then go buy some silly inductive Bible study thing and make everybody happy. How's that for a finish?
That was a strong finish. All right. We will meet back in here at 1:30. Gather in here just a little bit before that so we can get going. We'll hear from Philip about 2 Timothy, his experience and impact in that, and then we will talk about some shepherding things, and then we will talk about gathering as church. We'll have a paper on that. That's our afternoon. Okay, see you at 1:28. All these books You each get one copy. Please only take one copy. We only have enough for one copy. They stayed up all night to print them, and they're in the first education room in that hallway on the right. You can go pick yours up anytime, but please just take one.
Oh.